Well, welcome to another Friday night. I want to do another talk on the prisons that come out of complex trauma. And I want to look at one tonight that's not going to apply to everybody, but I think you might be surprised at how many people it does apply to. And it's people that engage in criminal behavior. And I'm not talking necessarily about hardened criminals. I'm talking about some good people that still engage in some criminal behavior. And so the purpose of this talk is not to be judgmental. It's not to go on a rant or moralistic crusade about all of that stuff. It's really to understand that what the research is showing is that people that end up in continuing criminal behavior, over 90% have complex trauma. And so the criminal behavior was actually a way to cope with the deep emptiness and pain inside. It was a way to try to get some needs met. And so it became a pattern of behavior that was designed to help them survive, but they didn't realize it was a maladaptive behavior. They didn't realize that it was going to start causing them trouble. And so what happens for so many people is that they do this criminal behavior and then they get caught and then they stop. But some, even though they say, I'm never going to do this again, this was terrible getting caught, something in them keeps them going back. And pretty soon they find that it's like a prison to them. They can't seem to escape it. Part of them wants to escape, but part of them keeps being drawn back to it. And so what we know is that the rate of recidivism or reoffending or going back to criminal behavior technically is 30 to 50% in most countries, but it's probably a lot higher. We just don't have the statistics for it. And so there's a definite element that this form of behavior has become a problem. It's become a prison. It keeps trapping them and taking them back to places that they don't want to go. And so I really want today to be about understanding what this is about. Not about judgment, but about understanding how this can come out of complex trauma. And so to begin with, let me just talk about different types of criminal behavior. I would say probably the most common one that I have dealt with clients is boosting or stealing. So people who steal food, clothes, small items, all the way up to car theft. But small item boosting for many is a very common behavior that they just get drawn back into over and over again. Then there's the drug dealer that we easily think of, people that get involved in gangs and organized crime. But then robbery, scamming, the con man, the hustler, and people that just, I'm going to go turn a trick. And that way I'm going to get some easy money. Then there's pimping and human trafficking, and then vandalism, crimes against property damage, arson. So all of those are different types of criminal behavior, and there's a spectrum of severity that you can see there, but they're all different types of criminal behavior. I think it's helpful in looking at this topic to really approach it that there's kind of three levels that we need to look at to understand this properly. So level one is the thing that initially got a person to engage in some type of criminal behavior. So usually stealing, boosting something. So it could be peer pressure from their friends. Their friends say, oh, I dare you to steal the chocolate bar from the store. And so they feel that pressure and they do it. For some people, though, stealing was a necessity. They didn't have any food at home. Their parents weren't working or their parents were in addiction. And so they had to steal to survive. Others, they grew up poor, so their basic physical needs were met. But all the kids at school had nice clothes and nice things, and they didn't have any of those nice things. So they got tired of being poor. They wanted some nicer things, and so they stole to get some nicer things. Sadly, in some families, parents got their children to steal. So they would go into a store, and their mom would get the child to steal. So they were carrying out their mom or their dad's desires to get free stuff. And then for some kids, the kid that got idolized at school was the bad boy, the boy that stole, the boy that did drugs, all of those things. And so they wanted to be like the bad boy. They wanted to get kind of validation from the bad boy, the respect of the bad boy. And so they engaged in criminal stuff in order to be like the bad boy. And then for some, as they look at in their teen years at getting wealthy, getting lots of money, they could go the path of hard work and slow accumulation, but that may not ever get them rich. Or they could go into criminal activity, which would get them lots of money, fast, a good lifestyle. And so that just seemed a more desirous route for them to take. So what's important to understand then is level 2. Why do some kids succumb to peer pressure to steal a chocolate bar where others don't? Why do some kids not care about the bad boy and not want to be like him, but others do? What is the underlying issues that make a child vulnerable to fall into criminal activity? That becomes a key thing to understand. So it's more than just peer pressure. There's something deep underneath that makes them vulnerable to peer pressure. And that's where we get into the complex trauma stuff. So first, the child is just not happy. There's a discontent there. Because of the complex trauma, there's unresolved needs, there's unresolved pain, there's an emptiness. And so what can happen is a fantasy belief that starts in the child's mind that says, if I had more money, if I was rich, if I had more things, then I would be happy. And that can set a child up to begin to think that criminal activity is the best way to get lots of money and things, and then I'll be happy. So it's based on deep, complex trauma where their needs weren't met, where there was a discontent due to abuse or neglect. The second one was a child who grows up who doesn't attach to parents in a secure way. So there's not a secure attachment, so they don't feel part of this family. They feel on the outside, a black sheep. So they long to connect. They long to feel like they belong somewhere, that they fit in. So they will then go to their next sphere of influence outside the family, which is their peer group. And they will try to fit in with a group of peers. And if that group of peers is into being bad boys, then they will try to fit in there. So if that need for connection is not met at home, they will be very vulnerable to go and get it met in a peer group that may not be healthy, and it could lead to criminal activity. Another thing that happens often in complex trauma is the child develops shame. I don't feel good enough. That's why I'm being neglected. That's why I'm being abused. That's why nobody's connecting with me. If I'm authentic, I get rejected and abandoned. So I feel less than, not good enough. And so how do I feel better about myself? Well, I need more money. I need the respect of my friends. I need on and on. So they begin to look at external things as the way to get respect and friends. And so let's do criminal activity. Now I got more money. Now I'm going to have people that respect me because of what I do. And so what you begin to see is this child is trying to get their needs met that weren't being met because of their complex trauma, and they're starting to see that crime is going to be the way to do that. Another thing that happens in complex trauma is often the child develops this deep anger and rebellion because life is not fair. Parents are not meeting their needs, but nobody's owning their stuff. So they just start to rebel against it, and that can lead some into, I'm going to do crime. That's my way of rebelling against my parents. That's my way of hurting my parents. Part of that also is my life is so unfair. I'm so angry at it. And then a sense of entitlement develops out of that. The world owes me. The rich owe me. I've been ripped off. everybody's deprived me, not treated me properly. I deserve a better life, and I'm going to grab it. So what is so important to realize that also sets a person up for this criminal activity is the soul murder that takes place in more severe complex trauma. And so in order to survive the abuse, the neglect, the abandonment, the child has to start shutting down their emotions, their empathy, their conscience, because those things just add more pain. And so don't care about anybody, don't feel emotions, don't have a conscience about what is right and wrong. And then you go into denial about your circumstances, about your behavior, because to think honestly about stuff just going to bother your conscience. Then you get into distorted thinking about things, rationale to justify stuff. So all of those things are happening in complex trauma, and that just sets a person up to be a prime candidate to engage in criminal behavior. So what I want you to realize is all of this shutting down of the very important alarm systems in our person, all of the unmet needs, all of the deep pain and discontent, constant survival mode is actually creating a person who's narcissistic. That I can do what I want, the rules don't apply to me, I'm better than everybody, I'm entitled, and that becomes, again, a prime candidate for criminal behavior. So there's a narcissistic element that is being formed out of the deep shame and pain of complex trauma. Somebody has put it into kind of 4 categories. So family-related risk factors, so that's what we've just described, all of the complex trauma that comes out of an abuse and neglect environment. Secondly, school-related risk factors. So a child that just doesn't achieve and do very well in school, or a child who's bullied or becomes a bullier, they are more prone to criminal behavior. And a child that just skips school a lot, doesn't care about school, they are more prone to fall into criminal behavior. Then it goes to community risk factors. So a disadvantaged neighborhood, so a very poor, rundown neighborhood, not a whole lot of organizations within the community for the child to participate in, a community that's just neglected by the government, and so it's just run down, all kinds of garbage, disrepair happening, there's an availability of drugs, there's gangs that are happening, there's a high turnover within those communities, and there's no closeness in the communities. You just don't do things together. That sets up a child to be a higher risk for criminal behavior. And then the peer risk factors. And so a child that doesn't feel connected at home then is prone to peer pressure and getting into gangs, etc., hanging around with friends that are involved in criminal behavior, that condone criminal behavior, early involvement in criminal behavior, having all of their friends who've got problem behaviors, people that just aren't as smart, and so they just aren't thinking about a future, a career, they're just trying to survive. People with social awkwardness, anxiety issues often become very vulnerable to get drawn into criminal behavior. So that takes us to the 3rd level. So level 1 and 2, the child tries it, here's the underlying reasons why they are vulnerable to it, but then they get caught and most quit. But some go back to it. Some continue to do it even though they were caught and there was consequences. What causes a person to go back to it? Bunch of different reasons that you're going to get from people as to why they continue to do criminal behavior. Many are subconscious. They don't even realize all of it, but they will realize some of it. And so number 1, probably the most common, is there's a rush. They get a rush out of planning it, the suspense of Am I going to be able to pull it off? And then when they do pull it off and not get caught, there's a huge rush. And what I want you to see is that that rush medicates all the underlying issues. The emptiness, the pain, the shame. It makes them feel better. It makes them feel pleasure. And so the rush becomes a powerful thing. Secondly, for many, it's fast money. It's a way to get money quickly and lots of it. And then a lifestyle, very instant, wealthy lifestyle. They can live high. That's a huge attraction to keep going back. For some, it becomes their identity. They now have gained respect as the bad boy, as the person who can supply drugs, as the person who can get extra things for people. And so that identity is so important to them. It's an identity that they think contains a lot of respect. Then for some, it's basically they hang around in a peer group where everybody's doing it. Everybody thinks that the way that they think about crime and justifying it. And so because of their peer group, they just are drawn back into doing it, even though something in them might want to quit. For some, there's a shame element that goes to when they pull off crimes and don't get caught, they feel smarter and better than everybody else. And it really feeds an egotism, a superiority thing. Others, they do it because they become drug addicts and they just need their drug fix, and the only way to get the money to get their drug fix is to steal. Some is just pure greed. They just want more and more. They think getting more is the answer. That's still that fantasy thinking that that's going to make them happy. And then some, there's a sense of power that comes out of being a criminal, that I get to do these things and get away with it. And I can manipulate people and do all of this stuff. There's power that comes out of that. So again, what I want you to see is people that go back to it, the criminal activity in their subconscious mind is actually meeting a whole bunch of needs, fixing a whole bunch of problems. It's fixing emptiness. It's fixing shame. It's gaining them respect. It's gaining them belonging and fitting in. All of those things are being met by criminal activity. And so it seems to be a solution, the best way to have a good life. That's where they're coming from. Next thing I want to look at is 5 addictive criminal stages that happen. So first of all, there's something that triggers a desire to go and commit a crime. So that trigger, there's maybe a conscious trigger, but there's also a subconscious trigger. There's a deep shame, a deep emptiness, deep pain, all of those things that we talk about, that all of a sudden they think crime is going to be the solution to my deep inner stuff. So it starts with something that triggers all of that. So Brady, who's written a lot about criminal behavior, has said the destructive and self-defeating behavior that criminals experience is not driven by material or economic motives, but is simply individuals trying to enrich their empty shell identities. Then once they're triggered, there's still that initial conscience that says, don't do it, that's wrong, you're taking from other people, you're going to hurt other people. So there has to be the second stage, which is a moral neutralization. And this is a very complex stage because you're playing mind games to justify doing it, to get rid of the internal conflict that you're feeling, the cognitive dissonance that you're feeling. So Brady again says the destructive and self-defeating behavior that criminals experience is fueled by irrational thoughts. The more a criminal engages in the activity, the more criminals become skilled practitioners in the art of self-deception. So some of the things that they do, the mind games, are called mollification, and that is they downplay the seriousness of the crime, or justifying or excuse making. And also with that, they blame others. They justify their poor choices. They make all kinds of excuses. So they always have a good reason for why they're doing it, but it's not really the real reason why they're doing it. They would never admit that. And so some of the justifications or the mollification that happens is, if I don't do it, somebody else will. So somebody's going to sell drugs anyway, so might as well be me and I can make the money. Or I steal from people, but it doesn't hurt anybody because they have insurance. So they're going to get it all back. Or, I'm not hurting anybody. I only steal things. It doesn't hurt anybody. Or they claim it's okay because others do it as well. Or others have done far worse than what I'm doing, so mine's not that bad. So they have all kinds of ways to justify or mollify their behavior. Part of what is happening is that they fail to consider the injury to others. They fail to consider that, yes, others might have insurance, but they have to go through, they've been violated, that they have had somebody take their stuff. Their insurance rates are now going to go up. The cost of goods is now going to go up for everybody. They don't want to look at those consequences. They just want to stick to their thing. It's not hurting anybody. And so this type of thinking is called corrosion and cut off. And so when you think of kind of engaging in a criminal activity, most people would immediately have their conscience says that's violating love, that's morally wrong, so their conscience would bother them. Then their fear of getting caught would bother them. Then their desire to be a productive citizen is going to be violated. And then there could have religious beliefs that are getting in the way. So you got all kinds of deterrents that would immediately say, don't do that criminal activity. So what has to happen in the mind of a criminal is corrosion, which is I got to get rid of every deterrent. I got to corrode it so that it gets rusty and it basically wears out, wears thin, and then I cut it off. I just block it out of my mind. So they go through all kinds of mental gymnastics to get rid of their conscience, to get rid of the fear of getting caught, to get rid of religious sentiments, to get rid of being a productive citizen, and find some way to lessen the intensity of that until the time they can get to a point where they just cut it out of their mind, where it no longer affects them. So that is a huge part of what is happening. So it's a process. It's not something they instantly just go to, I'm going to commit a crime, let's do it. They got to go through this mental process where they lessen the intensity of the deterrence till they can get to a point where they can just block it, where they can cut it off and it no longer influences their thinking. So that leads to the third stage, and that is now they're going to commit the crime. So again, Brady, the actual carrying out of criminal acts demands that criminals neutralize the unsavory aspects of their offenses, which we just talked about, lend meaning to inexplicable behaviors, so they got to somehow justify it, make it sound like it's good. Here, the criminal behavior is paired with, so now they're committing the act, exciting sensations associated with the risk of engaging in criminal behavior. There's an anticipated visceral feeling or mental excitement and stimulation, if not an elation, a thrill, a rush, and even a sense of euphoria. I've had many people that engage in criminal behavior tell me that when they're getting ready to go and commit a crime, all of a sudden they got to go to the bathroom and void their bowels because there's such a visceral excitement and intensity that is happening inside of them. So then they commit the crime. And that takes them to the fourth stage, the post-criminal act. They get away with it. There's an exhilaration, typically a flooding of mood-elevating feelings similar to an adrenaline rush, accompanied with thoughts that synthetically increase their sense of well-being. In short, the criminal act can help individuals feel like big shots, and criminals may justify doing something bad because it makes them feel so good. So many of these exhilarating feelings manifest themselves at a subconscious level. So they had the adrenaline rush of doing the crime, but then after, there's this exhilaration, euphoria that they got away with it. But then it goes to level 5, stage 5, and that is post-criminal act confusion. It's almost like a roller coaster. They hit this high and now they're going to descend to this low. And so the third and fourth stage of exhilaration and adrenaline rush is replaced with new, dramatic, and unexpected changes in emotional awareness. Here, they become confused, depressed, and socially withdrawn, as well as experience withdrawal-like reactions. So they might start sweating, getting headaches, anxiety, nausea, heart arrhythmia. And on a psychological level, they experience confusion, guilt, afterthoughts, misgivings, anxiety, depression, dramatic mood shifts ranging from feelings of sadness to hopelessness. So that's the 5 stages that take place for most in committing a crime. But what I want you to see also is that this criminal behavior stuff begins to operate like an addiction. They get a trigger, then they do the act, and they get the rush. Just like a person using drugs and alcohol, there's chemicals released in the brain that cause them to feel good, that cause them to feel very excited, tons of pleasure. And so they go back to it every time there's an emptiness, every time there's pain, every time there's emotions they don't want. They now go back to the criminal activity, just like a drug addict goes back to the drugs to medicate all of those feelings that usually are in the subconscious realm. And so criminal behavior can become an addiction for many people. So let me go to the characteristics of a person with criminal behavior. So first, for many, and you can, again, we're going to go about 30 of these. You can check off the ones that might apply to you. But there's very much an instant gratification. And that makes them impulsive. That makes them, they don't think of planning ahead. They don't think of kind of time that's realistic to get a nice house and a nice car and good vacations. They want it now. They want the best. They think they must have the best and they must have it now. So it's very much still living out of their limbic brain. We're going to see that over and over again. They want instant gratification, instant pleasure, instant success, instant wealth, all of it now. Then there's this reckless disregard for safety to self or others. So risk taking, hurting others, that becomes a key part of their who they are. Next, consistent irresponsibility. So just they don't want the responsibility of holding down a job, of working hard, of financial obligations. They want to be able to do what they want to do and still kind of have lots of money. And so there's an irresponsibility to them. Then a lack of remorse. So they do stuff, but then they just justify it. They don't have remorse that results in change. They might have moments of regret or moments of emotions, but not that brings about true change. And then lying. So lying becomes a way of life. And so they have premeditated lying where they plan what they're going to say. But then there's habitual lying. They just lie about everything. They're constantly shading the truth. They're constantly having secrets, not giving you the full story. So their whole life becomes very much around lying, dishonesty. I think it's important to understand that there's an antisocial behavior that's often very much underneath criminal behavior. And this might be helpful because you can begin to spot this in children. So antisocial behaviors are disruptive behaviors that hurt others, that hurt self, that disregard rules, that violate love. So it's a child that is not able to connect, and so they just get to the point where they lash out. They want to hurt somebody. There's a ton of anger that just needs to be vented. And so they start this very isolated behavior, antisocial behavior, venting of anger, hurtful, getting back because there's so much pain inside. Now, antisocial behavior tends to go on a spectrum from very severe to less severe, but it's all antisocial behavior. So here's some of the signs and symptoms of an antisocial personality disorder that you can look for. So a disregard for right and wrong. Rules don't apply to me, don't care. Persistent lying or deceit in order to exploit other people. Using charm to manipulate people. So being very charming, but it's all manipulation. It's not genuine love at all. Intense egotism, feeling superior and needing to display that. Recurring difficulties with the law. And so a person with antisocial behavior, what they're seeing is basically it comes out of severe abuse and neglect, complex trauma. And that means they have experienced and enter into poor relationships, abusive relationships. And then another sign is just irresponsible work behavior. So just not doing a good job, not showing up, being late, just not being responsible. And then repeatedly violating the rights of others, using intimidation, dishonesty, misrepresenting the facts. They just don't care about others. They don't love others the way they love themselves. There's a double standard that I treat myself very different from, and I want to be treated very different from how I treat you. Hostility, lots of anger issues that can end up in aggressiveness, violence, lack of empathy, lack of remorse, unnecessary risk-taking, dangerous behaviors, and then a failure to learn from negative consequences. So they get caught, there's negative consequences, they just don't learn from it. They just go back to it. So again, what you see is antisocial behavior comes out of deep complex trauma, deep shame, and a narcissistic thing. So all of those characteristics are characteristics of a narcissist. The next characteristic of a person with criminal behavior is what has become known as the very good person stance. And so basically they have to keep telling themselves that they're basically a very good person. They love their dog, they love their family, they love their elders. So they have very sentimental feelings to children, to animals, to their family, to the elderly. And so they go, see, I'm a good person. And so it's a type of way of denying looking at themselves totally and to see themselves accurately. They just see one part of themselves and try to make that their whole self. And then they use that to be able to justify continuing to do criminal behavior. Yeah, I'm a really good person. I do this a little bit, but that's all right. I'm a good person. Then often in criminal behavior, there's a criminal pride that develops. And that is just, they're kind of proud of what they do. They think it makes them better than others. They think they're smarter than others. They got more money than others. So there's a real sense of superiority that develops. But what is important is they have to maintain this image that they are superior to everybody. That criminal pride is huge for them. And often with that is there's a sense that they're unique, that they're just special. They're one of a kind. They're different from other people. They're in a class all of their own. So what you see from that is there's just this massive shame that is going into this highly overcompensating superiority stance. But with that, what they've found is that that criminal pride, that uniqueness is there, but there's moments that they have what is called zero state, where they actually feel their shame. They feel like a zero. They feel absolutely worthless. They're not being productive in positive ways in society. They're not loving people. They're actually hurting society. They're hurting others. And they just feel terrible about themselves. They feel hopeless to get out. They feel life is futile. And they go to this very dark place, often just for a short period of time, and then they get back to that pride stance. Another common thing is a victim stance. If they're held accountable for their actions, it's always somebody else's fault. There's always somebody else's to blame. They couldn't help it. They view themselves as, I was so poorly treated. I'm a victim of a very awful culture, of a very awful system. And so victim, victim, victim is their mindset, never taking ownership for their behavior. And so what comes with that is they say, I can't change. I can't act responsibly. I can't hold down a job. I can't be a consistent father. But at the very same time, they think there's nothing they can't do to succeed as a criminal. So they use I can't as an excuse to grow up, to get out of their limbic brain, to become responsible and acting in healthy ways. Often there's a sense of entitlement. If I want it, I need it. So they don't distinguish between legitimate needs and want. To them, if they want it, they must need it. And so if I want it and I need it, I should have it. I deserve as much as someone else who has worked harder than me. People owe me, the world owes me. I have to get my piece before you get yours. I deserve more than others. I deserve things for nothing. The world should suit me, not me suit the world. Things should go my way. Just that very narcissistic entitlement often begins to develop. And then there's a lack of trust. They just don't trust people. And it's partly because they don't trust themselves. They know they're not trustworthy. Now, they demand others trust them if they're in a gang, but they don't trust others. There's a double standard. Now, many will temporarily trust somebody, but only if they got something over them to force that person to be trustworthy. Otherwise, they just don't trust. With that, there's a refusal to be dependent. I do everything myself. I'm independent. Being dependent to them makes them weak. It makes them vulnerable. The problem is there's times in their life when they do need to depend on others, but they just refuse to look at that as being dependent. I just needed you for this little thing, but I'm not dependent. And then there's often just a huge longing for control, for power. That's a drive for them, and crime, criminal activity gives them that feeling of power and control. Anger, we've talked about, is again a huge part of their life, a deep well of anger from childhood that they're still rebelling against the system. They're still acting out. And then that can show up in their personal relationships where they become violent if they don't get their own way. They intimidate others. That's their way of gaining and maintaining control and power. Anger becomes a tool that they use all the time. Then often with criminals, they've shut down empathy for others, but they're still very sentimental. Sentimental about their moms, sentimental about their pets, sentimental about babies, sentimental about their new I'm in love and now I'm going to buy roses and gifts and romance this person. So they in some ways they feel they're very loving, but it's very narrow in its scope. Most people with criminal behavior where it becomes an addiction, a way of life, there's a ton of energy. that they have. And so they get an idea. And all of a sudden, they have a high level of mental activity, thinking about it, planning for it, and they're just bursting with energy. They can't sit still. Next one is very significant, and there's tons of fear. Fear of getting caught. Fear that their life is not going to amount to anything. They have fear of injury, fear of death, fear of being disrespected, fear of losing face. Fear, 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 but they will never admit that they're afraid. They think they're afraid of nothing. They're actually afraid of experiencing the sensation of fear, so they have shut down fear so much that they don't feel it at a conscious level, but it rules their subconscious. The next thing that we find is fragmentation. And it's like there's a Jekyll and Hyde. So they have to compartmentalize their life. Over here, they're a loving dad. They're trying to be respectable in their community. But over here, they're selling drugs. They're stealing. They're doing all kinds of stuff that's they know is wrong, that is hurting people. And so they got to compartmentalize their life. So they fragment. Now that starts to cause problems. And so here they're playing with their child. They're overwhelmed with love for their child, but then their stuff gets triggered and now they're stealing money from their kids in order to go buy drugs. There's this fragmentation. They promise they're going to go do stuff with their kids and spend the day with their kids, and then all of a sudden they change their mind and they're out with their buddies doing something. It becomes a huge issue for them, this contradictory internal world where Jekyll and Hyde is happening and the one that seems to be getting stronger, and it's causing them to break commitments, to do stuff that violates love, that begins hurting those they love the most. Many have a perfectionism. They in a whole bunch of life don't care about perfection at all, but when it comes to doing what they do, they have to do it perfectly. And then there's a suggestibility, and it's still, this comes out of that shame, that need to belong. And so if somebody else in their peer group makes a suggestion, we should do this, it has a powerful influence over them. If somebody outside of their group says you need to change and makes a suggestion as to how they change, they resist that. But within the group where they want to get accepted, they're very vulnerable to suggestions. Many with criminal behavior are known for deferring or putting things off. And so it's kind of in three areas. So they keep saying they're going to make the ultimate score, the ultimate crime, but they just keep putting off actually doing it. Or I'm going to make the ultimate crime, get the big score, then I'm going to quit. I'm going to do one more job, then I'm going to quit. And they just keep putting that off, keep putting that off. Or I'm going to start becoming more responsible. I'm going to start doing better habits. I'm going to start doing stuff every day and paying my bills, writing this letter, doing my taxes. And they keep putting off becoming responsible. So that leads to this failure to assume obligation. So the concept of obligation to a person with that criminal mindset, obligations interfere with what they want to do. Obligations are viewed as a position of weakness and vulnerability to somebody else controlling you. And so obligations are irritating to them. And if you try to tell them they need to be obligated to their kids, to their job, to a responsible life, they can often get quite angry about that, because obligations just interfere with what they want to do. So again, it's like their limbic brain is running the show, wanting to do whatever they want to do, when they want to do it, get instant gratification. And if anybody operates as their cortex and says you need to grow up and become responsible, they get angry about it. So they're always looking for the easy path. Who wants hard work? Who wants obligations? Who wants daily routine? Who wants structure? Who wants habits that you have to do every day? No, they want an easy path where there's not hard work, where they can just have a good life handed to them. And they think that's the path to happiness, is the easy path. And so part of that is they don't want to make an effort to endure adversity. They don't want to sit in uncomfortable emotions, in hard work, in working hard, waiting for the benefits to come later. They want to put the seed in the ground and have an instant crop. They don't want to endure waiting for that crop to grow, weeding that crop, watering that crop. They want it now with no adversity and not having to endure adversity. And so they don't want to expend effort. They don't want to have to go through hardship. They don't want to have to go through obstacles and frustrations. They just want to be instantly a big shot. So again, it's the limbic brain instant gratification. The next thing is many people in criminal behavior have never learned how to make good decisions to become responsible. So they don't know how to reason out the pros and cons, to go on fact-finding missions, to weigh out the costs of something, to weigh out the various options available to you. They've never done that. They don't know how to do that. And they're afraid to go ask somebody to teach them because that might make them look stupid. That might make them look like they don't know what they're doing. And so to save face, they just don't want to ever learn those tools. So they just keep making impulsive decisions that they hope will lead to the good life that they want. Next one is that many who end up, and the longer they stay in this lifestyle, the more secretive they become, the more closed they become. You can talk to them and they'll talk about 1,000 subjects, but nothing deeply honest, deeply personal. Being open and vulnerable is taboo. And so that leads to them being very much alone. They might be surrounded by people, but they feel totally alone. And then sexuality is an interesting one for many of them, and that is they have lots of sex, but they don't have satisfying sex. Sex becomes about conquest. Sex is seeing another person as their possession that they own, but sex is no longer that attachment-based satisfying sex. The final one is super optimism. So if they get an idea, they immediately think, I can do this. I can pull this off. This is going to happen. And so it's as good as done in their mind to get an idea about a crime, etc. They're super optimistic. They can get rid of all the doubts, all the fears, all the misgivings, and get to this super optimistic place. What happens, and what is so important to understand, is that when many of these people actually get caught and go into recovery and say, I want to change, many still have that mindset. And so what they think is, okay, I'm going to be successful in recovery. I've made up my mind and I'm going to do it. They don't think about what do I need to change. They don't think about the hard work of recovery. They don't think of the thousands of decisions that are going to have to be made that are different from how they would have made those decisions in the past. They just think, I made up my mind, I'm going to be super successful in recovery. All it takes is a decision and the willpower. And that causes many to go in recovery and they think, I don't need to do all this hard work. I don't need to do this. I just made up my mind. And they fail over and over again. So let me go to what then is healing. So for a person who comes out of a criminal behavior, you got to get past that super optimism, magical thinking place. Change recovery is not the result of one decision and then pure willpower. It means thousands of decisions, a total overhaul of your entire life. It means healing and changing at deep, deep levels, healing deep wounds, dealing with trauma, healing shame, dealing with deep fears, deep lies. That's what it's about. There's not a quick, magical fix. It requires hard work every day for the rest of the life. New habits, new attitudes, new behaviors, boundaries with old friends, building new healthy friends, dealing with triggers, dealing with temptation. It's a ton of work and change. It does not happen magically. And if you're not willing to do it, you will keep going back to that old way, and it will get darker and darker, and the consequences will get more and more severe. So underlying stuff, there's a deep shame element that every person in criminal activity has that has to be dealt with. Then there's a need to start connecting with safe people. You got to set boundaries with all the old peers, because they're going to keep trying to pull you back. You got to create a new surrogate family with safe, healthy people. That can be so hard. You feel like a misfit. You feel like you don't belong. You got to get rid of all that I'm special, I'm different thinking. You got to be willing to do this connection work. And then you got to find somebody. You don't need to tell everybody your secrets and all the stuff that you've done, but you got to find one safe person who's not going to judge you, who's not going to blab it, that you can start to get open and honest with. That is such an important part of the healing thing. So I don't know how much of this applies to you, or if it applies to you at all, but if it does, I hope this really helps you get a realistic understanding of your behaviors, where they came from, but that changing them is not some magical little thing where you just make up your mind and it's going to happen. It's going to take a ton of work and change, and I hope you're willing to do it. It's worth it if you are. Well, that's the end of another Friday night. Thanks again for being with us. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next.